Hi, my name is Stephanie Weber, and I'm speaking to you today from my office at Lehmbachhaus, Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Munich. We hosted an exhibition of Lea Lublin here in 2015, and today it is in the framework of the exhibition Political and Subjective Maps that I am speaking about Polish-born Argentine-French artist Lea Lublin. Thank you to Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, the curator of this exhibition, and ISLAA for inviting me. Lea Lublin, who lived from 1929 through 1999, came of age in Buenos Aires and started working as an artist there. She spent the bulk of her adult life in Paris, a city with an important and vibrant Argentine emigre community, as well as a larger international expat scene at the time. Gina Pane was Lublin's next-door neighbor, Antonio Segri, her studio mate, Jacqueline de Jong, an acquaintance with whom Lublin cooperated occasionally, Julio Leparc lived in town as well, and so on. So the topic of the exhibition at ISLAA is political subjective maps. Lublin did not exactly use maps as in a geographical or topological map, nor did she really use subjective maps. She did, however, make sketches of spatial layouts for her complex environments realized in Argentina in 1969, as well as diagrams for another environment or situation created in Santiago de Chile in 1971. You see a few documents about these works here. The artist loved diagrams. She believed in floor plans, sequences of impressions and images that she wanted visitors or participants, as she would later say, to experience, ideally in a certain order that the artist laid out. But does this sequence order plans, does this not run counter to what we associate with Lublin's 1960s work and with environments and happenings of that time more broadly in this post-1968 lib moment particularly? Well, let's see. One thing I can say preemptively is that Lublin's work is partly so fascinating because of its apparent antagonisms and contradictions, rules and freedom, sequence and its obliteration, toys and labor, exuberance and severity. Lublin and her infant son, Nicolas, lived in Paris during May 1968 and had been living there for a few years. Later that year, they relocated temporarily to Buenos Aires, where Lublin was to realize several works in cooperation with the famed Instituto Torquato di Tella, which by that time was already recognized as the place for the most cutting-edge projects of experimental visual art and music. Juda Kosice had showed there, Marta Minoprin, Yannis Xenakis had performed there, and so on. In a political situation which, since the military coup by Juan Carlos Onganía, had turned increasingly tense, anti-communist, anti-democratic, as well as prudish with regards to the arts, with frequent recourses to censorship of artworks and events, Lublin developed two complex and large-scale environments and interventions. She grouped those in her writing under the umbrella NOMA, Proceso a la Imagen, Procès à l'Image, image process. Her archive holds several versions of these texts in French and Spanish, dating back to as early as 1967. Image process is not the title of these works, but rather the inner logic that Lublin wanted to realize through them. The image process corresponded to, and here I quote her, an active decodification of the elements that constitute the system of representation. Now, what does that mean? Lublin was no artist of one-liners or quick and dirty one-time projects. Instead, her method was to engage in laborious, long-term quests through reading, writing, systematizing, trying out and demonstrating via the artwork or the experience in space. For image process, her quest was to clarify to herself and others the way seeing and being was socially conditioned and how we could learn to uncondition ourselves and learn thus how to see art, for instance. So preceding and preparing the environment was a project Lublin called Voix Claire or Ouvert Claro, her first attempt at this active decodification. What Lublin was getting at with these works was that art was couched in such a way in social conditions that it could not be seen for what it was. The Mona Lisa was couched both so deeply in Leonardo's fame as well as in contemporary bourgeois society, both of which are, of course, imbricated into each other, that it simply could no longer be seen as an astonishing painting, as a painting at a certain time, as a document of its time. Similarly, politics tended to be couched in the image regimes of contemporary society in such a way that via their figureheads, here for instance the ubiquitous, in Argentina, ubiquitous General San Martin, politics became a collection of void and mute icons. The object on top of the painting is a rubber ball which had water, and viewers could squeeze water on the painting, which would then, via this windshield wiper, wipe itself clean and be seen. So when Lublin in 1968-69 prepares her environment as part of this larger epistemological project titled Image Process, these works represent Lublin's attempt to incorporate three things: movement, space, and architecture. Her goal was to break the complacent consumption of art and shake people into an active relation with it. A relation with art that more closely resembled a relation with a person, or the vivid engagement that characterizes our alertness on the street, in traffic, in discussion with a friend. What she called active reflection was really a liberatory and liberated engagement with art, one that took class and art's uncomfortable position in relation to class into account. Space-time and movement were essential to achieve this, and with space-time and movement entering the picture with her environments, plans and maps also come in. The first work that Lublin realizes at the Di Tella Institute in Buenos Aires is Tiranautas, and we see here a layout for the work, so a sort of map. It is 1969. The man on the moon is all the rage, so the moon landing had just taken place in July, and Tiranautas is taking place in September. So we're in the midst of the space race, the Cold War. Astronauts are made into national heroes. So Lublin titling her work Tiranautas is, of course, a tongue-in-cheek response to that. Lublin was steeped in historical materialism, or more precisely Marx and Engels, psychoanalysis, Freud, as well as more recently Lacan. She was a creature of humans, of society, of working through neuroses and politics, a creature of text and discourse. Her interest was not in the overcoming of it all via space travel, but rather by social revolution. So let's look at what she proposes with this map of Tiranautas. Visitors would enter at the bottom of the page, so to say, and go into this layout, and which is not a labyrinth, meaning a variety of choices, but it's instead a path that winds into the center and then unwinds back out, curls in and out. So it's one direction, a sequence of spaces and sensorial experiences proposed by the artist here. Viewers or participants were wearing miners' helmets and advancing through a very dark space, through an area of rocks, an area of rye, then oats, onions, potatoes. These natural agricultural materials were accompanied by others, more contemporary ones, such as suspended inflatable plastic forms, fluorescent water. We see here that Lublin was precise and mindful to not give the work a sentimental or retrograde meaning. This was not back to the roots, but at the contrary, back to the stuff of the everyday, to the lived and tangible relation to the surrounding world, one that was not merely retinal and passive. For Lublin, this work was the demystification of art and to our relationship to the world, a very materialist work. In a paper that she wrote about the work, she said this is a work to demystify, to chew, to eat, to touch, and so on. What else do we see on the map? Marked in capital letters are invitations or impulses that were also visible in the environment, such as piense, think, marche libre, walk freely, or desnúdese, piense, get naked and think. Lastly, a statement rather than an invitation, arte será vida, art will be life. What to me is typical for Lublin here is a specific mixture of freedom and rule, of direction and the possibility of its disregard. After all, her injunctions take the form of orders, reflect and act, get naked. As if she was saying neither art nor life are without rules, without constraints or obstacles. Art needs constraints and rules within which something like freedom can occur. On a preparatory sketch found in her archive, Lublin marked obligatory passage through the grilles or rows. The passage must be realized with effort and difficulty, the path to liberation. We see here again the importance for her of a certain discipline, of a working through, which might be likened to a process of analysis. Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, in a text accompanying the exhibition at ISLAA, clarified that Lublin was not interested in behavioral experiments, and that is certainly true. Her goal was not to send people through a maze and see how they would react. She did instead believe that there was a didactic or pedagogical function of art, as well as a psychological one. This is something she tried to demonstrate and make tangible for the participants. A device that Lublin uses in Teranautas here for the first time, and that will be essential for the next two environments, is the projection of images onto translucent curtains, which were to be traversed by the visitors. In Teranautas, they were footage from one space into another, so that participants could see other participants who were contemporaneously walking through the work. In other works, there were art historical images as well as images of labor, but here it's this. In another of her concept text titled Image Process, so there are several, preceding the realization of Teranautas by roughly a year, Lublin wrote, "My works analyze the image process by means of its inscription into the space. The space is considered as a permanent medium of transformation. It is unlimited, anonymous, circumambient. Perceptions or pictorial impressions contemporaneously determined and annihilated. Graphic or three-dimensional structures and or impressions appear, offset, removed, superimposed, projected, and so on. Although the work appears as a closed entity," she continues, "it doesn't present itself as an elaborate, ready-to-consume product. Instead, what the work sets out to particularize is the process of its making, the artifice of its production. Therefore, the work is no more than a means by which to trigger the process of active reflection. The circuit is continuous, and the spectator finds himself amidst the process, which is change." Amazing text. Lublin's work on a more active viewer-artwork relationship continues and expands with her work, Fluvio Subtunal, installed the same year, 1969, in Santa Fe in the north of Argentina, in an abandoned department store. The work was huge, around 900 square meters. It also had like live sheep and a shooting range and like a funfair shooting range. I don't have time within this talk to go into the background of this work. It shall suffice to say that, or point out the relation of the state's prestige building project that Lublin's environment references, which was the Túnel Subfluvial Hernandarias, which connects the provinces of Santa Fe and Entre Rios. Túnel Subfluvial in Lublin's hands becomes the Fluvio Subtunal, so she turns this around. With this work, and here we go back to the topic of the exhibition at ISLAA, Lublin expands on her use of space, passage, and sequence as a means of revelation and deconditioning. Here we see a sketch or map for the work with including the form of its most remarkable element, the fluvio proper. This is this plastic tunnel, and different areas. The work was organized into 9 zones: the source, wind zone, technological zone, production zone, sensorial zone, fluvio subtonal, and so on. So we see here again the importance or revelatory quality that Lublin locates in people moving through the space. With the text of her image process in mind, her desire to make the viewer able to see through the conditioning of images, we understand that Lublin here approaches this mission through deconditioning, incorporating different modes through touch and sensorial stimulation, information about modes of production. Here she shows actually the workers constructing the actual tunnel in the region. And then we see projected images of them in her artwork. And as well through play and participation, a way of dragging art into the mundane, the funfair. Again here, what looked like a wild playground or funfair was based for the artist on an idea of sequence and order, as we understand from her concept paper, also titled Image Process number 3. The passage to the source was indispensable, quote. The participant needed to traverse the mobile columns, quote, of the wind zone. Other activities were optional or just properly out of control. Another key concept that Lublin manages to sharpen with Fluvio Subtonal is that of a dissolution of the opposites of inside-outside. So we see on the left a sketch based on the tunnel element, and there's this porous separation only between inside and outside because the tunnel is transparent. And so people interact while they're in different spaces. And we quite literally see some young visitors inside her work in a styrofoam space hanging out. By extension, one could argue that Lublin is getting here at a dissolution of dual conceptions of gender as well, as she clarifies by using this tunnel element a couple of years later. And she then doesn't call it fluvio subtonal, but penetración expulsión. And the fluvio is this inflatable architecture there in the background. And participants were to enter it via vulva-like lips and then proceed through a phallus-like form and then be expulsed again at the end. So Lublin pointed out these formal analogies. This is not my interpretation, but she talked about lips and the vagina and the phallus, which are here combined into one form. So, and with this inside and outside, which was, by the way, a whole trope in this time. So you have various artists, Ligia Pape, Sadamasa Mutonaga, Senga Ningudi, who work with this exact idea of the inside-outside and its collapse in sculpture. So, and with inside and outside, we're also already at the last project that Lublin did under the image process title. And this is Cultura dentro y fuera del museo, so inside and outside the museum, a project realized in Santiago de Chile in 1971. So we're in Chile doing Allende, and we are in the thicket of Lublin's relation to, if not maps, but certainly the diagrammatic form. The work was constructed as a path again. However, and importantly, Lublin here starts the work outside an actual museum on the streets and then leads people inside the museum. See the outside here. Some familiar elements reappear, inflatable forms, as well as image projections of artwork. Of course, this device is Lublin's method to establish a sensorial relation to these works, or as she would say in an interview a couple of decades later, and in a more psychoanalytical and Lacanian phrasing, quote, this penetration of images was obviously a traversing of the mirror because the relationship of viewers to painting is always one of identification. Traversing the screen painting somehow meant permeating oneself by means of an external object of identification. Quote end. But the penetration of paintings, as she calls it, was just one way to defamiliarize art in a productive way. Lublin's approach is always two-pronged at least, sensorial and intellectual. A mega diagram was part of Dentro y Fuera del Museo, a diagram prepared by Lublin with much care. There are many sketches of this and collages in her archive, synthesizing and organizing her research and knowledge spatially as documents as these images show. For Lublin, these diagrams were an important didactical device that acted on the inside and outside to mirror her title as well. So we see on this diagram, she laid out basically the history of certain disciplines and the ruptures within them. So political economy, psychoanalysis, philosophy, and so on. We see, for example, like errors going from de Saussure to Chomsky and from Hegel to Marx and so on. Lublin deployed diagrams internally to clarify her own ideas to herself, as a tool for learning and remembering, for relating ideas and historical currents to each other. But she also deployed diagrams externally to defamiliarize people's learned way of relating or not relating to art by explaining to them how art and images had been couched in bourgeois society, severed from labor and the conditions of its production, arts production, severed from the unconscious and its working, severed from everyday experience. It was by understanding the working of capitalist society to understand our severed relation to art, and by seeing through this rupture and agreeing to work through it, one might end up being able to see or experience art for the first time. As her mantra of the dissolution of inside and outside, diagrams were for Lublin one means to do so and dissolve these boundaries by sharing her knowledge, by attempting to bring artists and public to the same level of knowledge, and thus to approximate outside what she calls the social process and inside the production of knowledge and art in the museum. To me, it is an uncomfortable question as an art worker, and I guess I would extend this to all of us. If this situation has today improved, when we read the hope that Lublin formulates back in this time, we might wonder how far we have progressed and what else there is to do. She said that her goal was to elucidate the struggles and contradictions which have created the unbridgeable gulf between culture and society. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.